Maple Ridge. Tuesday afternoon. A woman sits in a silent cabin holding a phone that should have been hung up. The lake outside is glass calm, reflecting the peaceful pines, but inside, the air is suffocating. My name is Alexandra Pierce, and for 29 years I believed I was a daughter. Then, through the static of an open line, I heard my father speak the words that turned me from a child into a target. He didn't want to protect me, he wanted to erase me. What do you do when the people who gave you life decide to steal yours? You stop being family, and you start being a witness. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Most people think betrayal feels like a knife in the back, a sudden sharp shock that leaves you gasping for air. They imagine it as a dramatic confrontation or a discovered letter. For me, it wasn't anything that cinematic. Betrayal was just a sentence my father said when he thought I had hung up the phone. It was the moment the static cleared and the people I had burned my entire life to keep warm decided I was no longer fuel, but ash to be swept away. I'm telling you this from a small town called Maple Ridge. If you drove through, you'd think it was charming. You'd see the diner where I worked in high school, the hardware store where my dad held court, and the church where my mother cried softly in the third pew every Sunday. But you wouldn't see the invisible wires that held me here. I am Alexandra Pierce, and for 29 years my identity could be summed up in two words: the good daughter. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who canceled the move to Chicago for a dream job because my mother had a health scare that turned out to be stress-induced indigestion. I was the one who poured my savings into my father's failing construction business because he convinced me it was just a temporary cash flow problem, not a lifetime of mismanagement. To understand why what happened next broke me, you have to understand the layout of my world. It was a triangle of obligation. At the top was my father, Richard Pierce. In public, he was the charismatic local builder, the guy who bought the first round of drinks, the man who shook your hand and looked you in the eye. At home, he was a different creature, controlling, dismissive, a man who viewed affection as a currency he only dispensed when you made him look good. Then there was my mother, Elaine. She wasn't cruel, not exactly, she was just fragile. She weaponized her own helplessness, turning guilt into a heavy blanket that she draped over my shoulders whenever I tried to stand up. And hovering around them like a vulture in a cheap suit was my uncle Mark, Richard's brother. Mark was the idea guy. He was always there with a contract, a scheme, or a fix for the money problems, but somehow he never opened his own wallet. He just whispered in my dad's ear. And then there was the lake house. It was the only thing in my life that felt truly mine. My grandmother Rose, my father's mother, had left it directly to me 3 years ago. It wasn't a mansion, just a sturdy cedar-shingled cabin on a prime stretch of water about 30 minutes out of town. The property values had skyrocketed recently, turning the modest retreat into a significant asset, but to me it was a sanctuary. It smelled of old paperbacks and pine needles. It was the place where Grandma Rose had taught me that I existed outside of my parents' needs. When she died, she bypassed her sons entirely and put the deed in my name. My father had raged about it for weeks, claiming it was a mistake, but the will was ironclad. Over the last year, however, the boundaries had started to blur. My dad called it our family retreat. Uncle Mark stored his boat there without asking. Mom started hosting her book club in the living room. I let them. I let them because I was the good daughter, and in America we are taught that family comes first, that you don't shut the door on your own blood. I believed in those values. I believed in hard work, loyalty, and the idea that if you sacrificed enough, you would eventually be appreciated. I was drowning in family first, unaware that I was the only one swimming. The day my life changed started with a mundane administrative task. It was a Tuesday late morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the lake house, sorting through a stack of maintenance files. We had a warranty issue with the dock repairs from last winter, and I couldn't find the original contractor agreement. I knew my dad had taken the folder to look over weeks ago and never returned it. I picked up my phone and dialed his number. It rang 4 times before he picked up. I could hear the distinct clatter of silverware and the roar of a televised game in the background. He was at the End Zone, the local sports bar where he and Mark held their business lunches. Yeah, he answered, his voice clipped. He hated being interrupted when he was with Mark. Hey, Dad, I said, keeping my voice light. Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for the warranty paperwork for the dock. Did you leave it in your truck? I'm in a meeting, Alex, he snapped, the charisma gone. I don't have time to dig through my glove box right now. I'll look later. Okay, it's just that the deadline to file the claim is… I said later, he barked. Then his tone shifted slightly, performing for an audience. We're discussing important family business, honey. I'll call you back. All right, thanks, Dad. Bye. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ready to press the red button. But before my thumb could touch the screen, I heard a sound. It was the thud of a phone being set down on a hard wooden table. He hadn't tapped end. He had just set the phone down, assuming I would hang up. I hovered my thumb over the button. I should have hung up. That's what a polite person does. But then I heard my name. Alex is getting pushy about that paperwork. My father's voice came through, slightly muffled, but clear enough. The background noise of the bar seemed to dip, or maybe my focus just sharpened to a razor's edge. She's just trying to play landlord. Uncle Mark's voice slid in, oily and amused. Let her feel important for a few more weeks. It makes the transition easier. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I sat perfectly still in the silent cabin, the phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt. I'm tired of asking permission to use my own mother's house, Mark, my father grumbled. I heard the clink of glass on a table. I need that equity. The business is bleeding out. If we don't get that deed signed over by next month, I'm done. Relax, Richard, Mark said. And then came the sentence that severed my life into before and after. Alex isn't a daughter. She's leverage. Once we get that deed, we erase her and start over. I felt the blood drain from my face. My vision tunneled. Leverage. Not a person. Not a child. An asset to be liquidated. I know. My father sighed, and the casualness of his tone was what hurt the most. He wasn't agonizing over it. He sounded annoyed, like he was discussing a stubborn stump he had to remove. But she's stubborn. Rose filled her head with all that independence crap. Mark laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. She was the practice kid, Richie. The lake house is the only thing she's good for now. We just need to play the angle. Tell her it's for tax purposes. Tell her the IRS is coming after the estate and she needs to sign it over to you to protect it. She's financially illiterate. She'll believe it. And if she balks, my father asked. Then we go nuclear, Mark replied smoothly. We stage an intervention. We sit her down, tell her she's been erratic, ungrateful. We tell her we sacrificed everything for her and this is how she repays us. You know how she is. She can't handle the guilt. She'll sign just to make us stop looking at her like we're disappointed. Yeah, my father said. We sacrificed everything for her. She owes us this. She owes us everything, Mark agreed. Once the title is in your name, we kick her out, sell the place, and split the profit. You pay off the business debts, I take my consulting fee, and we're clear. She can go live in an apartment in the city like she always wanted. We're doing her a favor, really. Erase her, my father murmured, testing the words. Sounds clean. Clean as a whistle, Mark said. Cheers to that. I heard the glasses clink again. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, my hand trembling so violently I almost dropped it. I looked out the window at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the gray sky and the tall pines that lined the shore. It was the same view I had looked at 1,000 times, but now it looked like a stage set. The silence in the cabin was deafening. For years I had told myself that my parents were flawed but loving. I told myself that their demands were just a byproduct of their struggle. I thought I was the glue holding the family together. But in that moment, staring at the calm water while my father and uncle drank to my destruction, I realized the truth. My family wasn't trying to protect me. They weren't leaning on me. They were planning to harvest me. I was a pig being fattened for slaughter, and the butcher was my own father. They wanted to erase me. They wanted to take the one thing Grandma Rose had given me to ensure my freedom, sell it to cover their own failures, and leave me with nothing but the guilt they had carefully cultivated in my soul since birth. My thumb was still hovering over the screen. The call was still active. I could hear them ordering another round. I didn't hang up. I didn't scream. A cold, hard clarity washed over me, replacing the shock. If they wanted to play games with my life, I needed to know the rules. I swiped open my apps, found the voice recorder, and hit the red button. The recording on my phone stopped, but the voices echoed in the silence of the cabin. I didn't play it again immediately. I didn't have to. The words were already searing themselves into my memory, rearranging my entire history. She's leverage. That single sentence was a key that unlocked a door I had kept bolted shut since childhood. I sat there staring at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, and finally let myself look at the architecture of my life. It wasn't a home, it was a cage built out of guilt. I realized then that this trap hadn't been sprung today. It had been under construction for 20 years. Growing up, dinner at the Pierce household wasn't about conversation. It was an accounting seminar. My father would sit at the head of the table, not eating, just staring at a stack of bills next to his plate. He would sigh loud and ragged before looking at me and saying, "Do you know how much the electricity cost this month, Alexandra? Do you know what I had to do today, just to keep the lights on for you?" I would shrink in my chair, staring at my peas, feeling a heavy, shapeless shame for existing, for consuming, for needing heat and light. In our house, rent wasn't paid in money. It was paid in silence, in constant gratitude, in the suppression of any desire that didn't serve the family unit. Uncle Mark was the enforcer of this debt. He was the fun uncle to the outside world, the guy who bought fireworks on the 4th of July and slipped me $20 on my birthday. But there was always a hook. He'd lean in close, smelling of cologne and stale tobacco, and whisper, "You're a lucky girl, Alex. Your dad works himself to the bone for you. You'd be nothing without your parents. Don't you ever forget that." "I won't," I would promise. And I didn't. I paid my debt by making myself small. I paid it by staying close. The only person who didn't subscribe to this ledger of guilt was my grandmother Rose. She was my father's mother, but she seemed to belong to a different species entirely. She was a woman of earth and iron, practical to a fault. While my parents taught me how to apologize, Rose taught me how to read a contract. I spent my summers here at this lake house, and those months were the only times I felt like a distinct human being. I remember sitting on the porch swing with her when I was 18. I was crying because I wanted to go to an out-of-state university, but my father had told me it would bankrupt the family. Rose had handed me a tissue and an amortization schedule. "Stop crying and look at this," she had said sternly. She taught me what a mortgage was, how interest compounded, and most importantly, what a deed represented. "In America, land is the only real freedom, Allie," she told me, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "If you own the dirt under your feet, nobody can move you unless you let them." Her most important lesson, however, wasn't about math. It was about instinct. "Never sign anything when your heart is shaking," she told me once, watching me hesitate over a permission slip I didn't want to sign. "If you feel guilty, put the pen down. Guilt is a trick used by people who want to take something from you for free." When Rose passed away 3 years ago, the reading of the will was tense. My father and Uncle Mark had walked in with the swagger of men about to cash a lottery ticket. They had already been talking about developing the lakefront property, maybe putting in condos. When the lawyer announced that the lake house, the land, the structure, and the contents was left solely to my granddaughter, Alexandra Pierce, the air left the room. I remember my father's face. It wasn't grief. It was a terrifying frozen rictus of a smile. "Well," he had said, his voice tight enough to snap, "that's unexpected, but it stays in the family, right? That's what matters." Uncle Mark's jaw had clenched so hard I saw the muscle jump. But the deed came with a handwritten note from Rose. So you always have a place no one can take from you. She knew. She knew exactly who they were. But I hadn't listened to her warning. Over the last 3 years, I let them erode my boundaries until the lines of ownership were practically invisible. It started small. Hey Alex, can we store some of the business equipment in the shed for a month? Then it was, your mom needs a weekend away, we're taking the cabin. Then, we're thinking of this as our retirement asset really since we supported you for so long. I remembered the job in Chicago last year. It was a senior design position, a massive salary bump, a chance to start a life where nobody knew my last name. I had the offer letter in my hand. When I told my parents, my mother had wept for 3 days straight. My father had sat me down looking grave and said, I don't know if the business can survive another winter without your help on the books, Alex. If you leave now and we go under, well, I hope you can live with that. I turned down the job. I stayed. I stayed to help. And now listening to the recording again, I realized that my sacrifice hadn't bought their love. It had only bought them time to plot my removal. I pressed play one more time, skipping to the middle of the conversation. The background noise of the bar was loud, but Richard's voice cut through. We'll get her to sign, and if she drags her feet, I know a guy who can handle the notary stamp. We just need her signature on one form to get the ball rolling. Whatever it takes, Mark's voice agreed. She doesn't check her credit anyway. By the time she notices, the equity line will be maxed out and will be liquid. They weren't just talking about emotional manipulation anymore. They were talking about fraud. They were talking about forgery. My phone buzzed in my hand, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. I looked down. It was a text message from my mother. Hi, honey. Hope you're having a relaxing day at the lake. Quick favor, Dad and Mark are trying to sort out the rental insurance for the boat for this summer, and the company needs a copy of the primary driver's license. Can you snap a photo of the front and back of your ID and text it to me? ASAP, love you. The text was punctuated with a heart emoji. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice water. The boat rental. We didn't rent the boat. We owned a beat-up pontoon that didn't require that kind of paperwork. And even if we did, why would they need my license? I was the owner of the property, but not the boat. Unless they weren't renting a boat. My mind raced back to the recording. Whatever it takes. I know a guy who can handle the notary stamp. To forge a deed or to take out a loan in my name, they would need identification. They needed a clean copy of my driver's license to verify the identity of the person signing the documents. They were trying to get me to hand them the final piece of the puzzle to steal my own house, and they were using my mother and her cheerful, innocent emojis to do it. I looked at the message again. Love you. It wasn't a request. It was a phishing attempt. And it was coming from the woman who gave birth to me. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I stood up the chair, scraping loudly against the wood floor. I walked to the window and locked it. Then I walked to the front door and threw the deadbolt. It was a sunny afternoon, but suddenly I felt like I was in a siege. I wasn't the good daughter anymore. I was the target. And if I wanted to survive this, I had to stop acting like family and start acting like a witness. The trap was baited with pot roast. It was Sunday, 3 days after I had met with Nina, and my father had summoned me to the house for family dinner. He made it sound casual, but the air in the dining room was so thick with tension, it felt like breathing through wool. My mother had cooked my favorite childhood meal, slow-roasted beef with carrots and potatoes, and the smell, which used to make me feel safe, now just turned my stomach. I sat at my usual spot. My father was at the head. Uncle Mark was to his right, and my mother was hovering near the kitchen, her eyes darting between us like a nervous bird. Mark was dressed nicer than usual, wearing a crisp button-down instead of his usual polo. He was smiling too much. It's good to have everyone together, my father said, carving the meat with aggressive precision. We don't do this enough. Family unity, that's what matters. I nodded, keeping my hands in my lap so they wouldn't see them shaking. My phone was already on the table screen, face down, the voice memo app running silently. The roast looks great, Mom, I said. My voice sounded thin to my own ears. We ate in a stilted silence for 20 minutes. Small talk about the weather, the neighbors, the construction business. Then, as the plates were cleared, the atmosphere shifted. It was a physical drop in temperature. My father wiped his mouth with a napkin, set it down, and looked at Mark. Alex, my dad started leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. We've been worried about you. Worried? I asked, forcing a confused look. You're taking on too much, Mark chimed in, his voice smooth as oil. That lake house, it's a lot for a young woman to manage alone. The taxes, the maintenance. We've been talking, and we hate seeing you burdened like this. We risked everything to raise you, to give you a good start, and we can't sit by and watch you drown in responsibility. We just want to help, my mother added softly from the corner. We want to protect you, honey. Mark reached under the table and pulled out a thick manila folder. He slid it across the tablecloth. It stopped inches from my water glass. We had the lawyers draw this up, Mark said. It's a family trust. The idea is simple. You transfer the deed of the lake house into the trust. Your dad and I will manage the assets, handle the bills, the taxes, everything. You won't have to lift a finger. You can just enjoy it. I stared at the folder. I knew exactly what was inside. It wasn't protection. It was an eviction notice disguised as charity. So, I said, keeping my voice steady, channeling every ounce of Rose's spirit I could find. I sign the deed over to the trust and you guys control the property. We manage it, Richard corrected quickly. For the family. For you. But I wouldn't own it anymore, I said. You'd be a beneficiary, Mark said, dismissing the details with a wave of his hand. Look, Alex, nobody has to know the specifics. Once we're on the deed, we can move some equity around to stabilize the business. You won't even feel it. It's just paper shuffling. I felt a cold sweat prickling my hairline. Move some equity around. He was admitting it. They were going to leverage the house to the hilt, strip the value, and leave me with a hollow shell. I don't know, I said, hesitating on purpose. Grandma Rose left it to me specifically. She wanted me to have the deed. My father's face hardened. The mask of the concerned parent slipped, revealing the desperate, angry man beneath. Rose didn't know the reality of our finances, Alexandra. You were never meant to keep that place, kid. Grandma just parked it with you until we were ready. Don't make us regret letting you stick around this long. The words hit me like a slap. Parked it with you. Even my inheritance was just a temporary inconvenience to them. You wouldn't threaten your own parents with lawyers or rules, would you? Mark asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. This is family. We sacrifice for each other. Rose's voice echoed in my head. Never sign when your heart is shaking. My heart wasn't just shaking. It was vibrating out of my chest. But my mind was clear. I needed to get out of there, and I needed that folder. I need to think about it, I stammered, reaching for the folder. It's a lot of legal language. I want to read it over tonight. I'll let you know tomorrow. Just sign it now, Alex, my dad said, his hand twitching toward the pen. Save us the trouble. I can't sign it without reading it, Dad. You taught me that. I lied. I promise I'll look at it tonight. I stood up, clutching the folder and my phone. The air in the room was volatile, like a gas leak waiting for a spark. Mark looked at Richard, and for a second I thought they might physically stop me. But they didn't. They were banking on my conditioning, on the decades of guilt they had installed. They thought I was just being a nervous daughter who would eventually fold. Don't take too long, Mark called out as I walked to the door. Opportunities like this don't last. I didn't look back. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just drove, staring at the white lines on the road, realizing that the people in that house weren't my family. They were creditors coming to collect a debt I never agreed to. That night, I made the decision. I wasn't going to fight them for custody of the house. I wasn't going to wait for them to forge my signature or sue me. I was going to scorch the earth. The next morning, I initiated Operation Don't Erase Me. I met with the off-market broker Nina had recommended. He was a sharp guy named David who specialized in quick, discreet sales to corporate buyers. I played him the recording of the ambush. I showed him the title. "I want to sell," I told him. "Cash only, no signs in the yard, no listing on Zillow. I want to close in 10 days. "I have a buyer who has been looking for lakefront property in that area for a retreat center," David said. "They can wire the funds and close in 7 days if the title is clean." "Do it," I said. The next week was a blur of covert ops. I hired a moving company that specialized in high-security moves. I gave them the blue list, the inventory of things that were legally mine. I rented a storage unit in a town 2 counties over. I signed a lease on a new apartment in a gated complex in the city, a place with security cameras and a doorman features I never thought I'd need to protect myself from my own father. Every time my phone buzzed with a text from Mark or my dad asking, "Did you sign yet?" I sent back vague stall tactics, still reading through the fine print. "Not feeling well today, will look tomorrow." I was buying time. Every hour I stalled was an hour closer to the closing date. It was Thursday night. The closing was scheduled for Friday morning. I was in my apartment surrounded by boxes taping up the last of my life. The lake house was empty of my things. The keys were already in an envelope for the new owners. My phone buzzed on the floor next to me. It was a text from Uncle Mark. I picked it up and read the screen. The pretense of family unity was gone. "Sign the papers by Friday, Alex, or we'll make sure everyone knows how you turned your back on your parents. We'll ruin your reputation in this town. Don't make us erase you from this family for real." I stared at the glowing screen. A week ago, this would have crushed me. Now it was just evidence. I took a screenshot. I opened my email and sent it to Nina with the subject line Exhibit G. "You can't erase someone who has already moved," I whispered to the empty room. Then I turned off my phone, lay down on my mattress on the floor, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the escaped. The timing had to be precise. It was the only way to ensure safety. On Friday morning, while my father and Uncle Mark were driving toward the lake, their truck bed loaded with suitcases and boxes of temporarily stored items, I was sitting in a title company office 3 towns away. I signed the final closing documents at 10:00 a.m. The wire transfer hit my new secret bank account at 10:15 a.m. By 10:30 a.m., the new corporate owners had their property management team on site changing the locks. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. I knew exactly what happened. They would have pulled into the gravel driveway acting like they owned the place. They would have marched up the steps, tried their key, and found it didn't turn. Then they would have seen the plain white envelope taped to the door at eye level. Inside was a single key to a local storage unit, a detailed inventory list of every item they had ever left at the cabin, and a note I had typed on plain paper. "The house is sold. Your belongings are safe. Do not contact me." I turned my phone off for the weekend. I knew the explosion would be nuclear, and I refused to let the fallout reach me. But silence only holds back the storm for so long. Monday morning, they brought the war to me. I worked at a mid-sized architectural firm downtown, a place with glass walls and a quiet professional atmosphere. I was reviewing blueprints on the 2nd floor when I heard the commotion in the lobby. It started as a raised voice, then escalated into shouting that echoed up the atrium. "I don't care who she is to you. She's my daughter and she's a thief." My stomach dropped, but my hands remained steady. I walked to the railing and looked down. Richard Pierce was red-faced, pointing a finger at the terrified receptionist. Uncle Mark was pacing behind him, looking like a caged animal, while my mother stood by the revolving doors, sobbing loudly into a tissue. "We know she's here," Mark bellowed, his voice cracking. "Tell her to come down here and explain why she stole our retirement." The entire office had stopped working. Colleagues were peering out of cubicles. Clients in the waiting area were clutching their purses. It was a scene of absolute humiliation, but for the first time in my life, I realized the shame didn't belong to me. It belonged to them. Security stepped in 2 large men in uniforms blocking the path to the elevators. "Sir, you need to leave or we will call the police." "Call them!" My father screamed, spit flying from his mouth. She sold my house. She embezzled family property. I didn't go down. I didn't hide either. I stood at the railing, perfectly visible. When my father looked up and locked eyes with me, his face twisted into something demonic. You ungrateful little... Before he could finish, the firm's corporate counsel, a sharp-edged woman named Sarah, who Nina had briefed over the weekend, stepped into the lobby. She didn't shout, she just walked up to the security guards and pointed at the trio. These individuals are harassing an employee, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the noise. Ms. Pierce has a petition for a restraining order ready to be filed. If they are not off the premises in 30 seconds, have them arrested for trespassing and disorderly conduct. Mark surged forward, trying to bully the lawyer. You think the law is going to save her? We'll ruin her. We'll tell everyone she abandoned her own parents to die in the street. I pointed to the ceiling corner. You're on camera, Mark, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the lobby it carried. Audio and video, keep talking. You're just building my case. Mark froze. He looked at the camera, then at me. The realization that he was losing control hit him. He grabbed Richard's arm, whispered something, and they retreated, dragging my weeping mother out the door. That afternoon, Nina called me. They want a meeting, she said. They claim there's been a misunderstanding. They want to meet at a neutral location to clear the air before they file a lawsuit. Why should I meet them? I asked. Because we need them to admit they know the house is sold, Nina said. And I want to see what cards they think they're holding. We meet in public. I'll be at the next table. You record everything. We met at a coffee shop on the edge of town 2 hours later. I sat with my back to the wall. When they walked in, they looked different, smaller, older. The rage from the lobby had been replaced by a calculated performance of grief. My mother spoke first. Alexandra, she said, her voice trembling. How could you? We're family. A good daughter doesn't do this to her people. A good daughter, I repeated flatly. Is that what I was? Of course, my father said, leaning in, trying to conjure the old authority. We raised you. We sacrificed for you. And you go behind our backs and sell the family legacy. We can fix this, Alex. You can undo the sale. We can say you were under duress. We can get the deed back. The sale is final, I said. The money is in an account you can't touch. The new owners have the keys. You have no right, Mark hissed, the mask slipping. That equity was ours. We had plans. You owe us. I owe you nothing, I said. I pulled my phone out and set it on the table. You talk a lot about family, Dad, about sacrifice. But you have a funny way of defining it. I tapped the screen. The audio file from the bar started playing. Alex isn't a daughter. She's leverage. Once we get that deed, we erase her and start over. The color drained from my father's face. It was instant, like a light switch flipping off. He stared at the phone as if it were a bomb. She was the practice kid. The lake house is the only thing she's good for. I let it play until the sound of their laughter filled the space between us. Then I paused it. The silence at the table was heavy, suffocating. My mother had stopped crying. She was staring at the table, refusing to look at me. Mark was jaw clenched, staring out the window. You didn't just try to steal a house, I said, my voice low and steady. You tried to erase me. You sat in a bar and planned to strip me of my home, my identity, and my sanity. You were going to use a fake intervention to gaslight me into signing away my future. We were desperate, my father whispered. It wasn't an apology. It was an excuse. I don't care, I said. I know about the credit inquiry, Dad. I know about the intent to transfer document you had your notary friend forge. I know you were already spending the money before I even knew the plan. Mark's head snapped up. You can't prove that. I don't have to, I said. The sale is done. I'm walking away. If you come near me, if you contact me, if you show up at my job again, I will release this recording to everyone in town. I will give the evidence of the attempted fraud to the district attorney. I will burn your reputation to the ground. I stood up. I looked down at the people who had raised me, and I realized I wasn't looking at parents. I was looking at strangers who had been mugging me for 30 years. I'm not the one who destroyed this family, I said. You did. I walked out. I didn't look back. I got into my car, my heart hammering against my ribs, but for the first time, it was the rhythm of adrenaline, not fear. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Nina, who was still inside the coffee shop. Don't drive off yet. Check your email. My paralegal just got a notification from the county clerk. I opened the email. It was a filing alert. Subject deed submission. Nina's next text came through a second later. They did it. They were so desperate they didn't check the records. They just submitted the forged deed to the court claiming you signed it over last week. They just tried to transfer a property you no longer own using a signature that isn't yours. I stared at the phone. They had walked right into the trap. They just handed us everything we need, Nina texted. Criminal fraud. Perjury. It's over. The air in a courthouse doesn't smell like justice. It smells like floor wax, stale coffee, and anxiety. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Nina, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, casting a pale, sickly glow over everything. It felt surreal. I was 29 years old, sitting in a civil courtroom, waiting to defend myself against the people who had taught me how to tie my shoes. Across the aisle, my family had committed fully to their performance. My father, Richard, was wearing a soft beige cardigan I had never seen him wear in my life. He looked frail, slumped in his chair, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. Uncle Mark had traded his slick suits for a humble, ill-fitting jacket that made him look like a confused retiree. My mother sat behind them, a silent, weeping statue of maternal grief. If I didn't know them, if I didn't know the wolves living beneath those sheepskins, I would have felt sorry for them too. Their lawyer, a loud man with a shiny forehead, opened with a narrative that painted me as a monster. He used words like elder abuse, unjust enrichment, and betrayal. He claimed that I had always promised the lake house would be theirs in the end, that they had poured their life savings into maintaining it while I was away at college, and that I had tricked them into a false sense of security before selling the property out from under them to fund a lavish lifestyle. He claimed they had tenancy rights. He claimed I was unstable. Your Honor, he bellowed, gesturing to my father, this man sacrificed his own financial stability to raise this woman, only to be thrown onto the street in his twilight years. I felt the eyes of the few people in the gallery boring into my back. It was suffocating. But Nina just touched my elbow gently. Breathe, she whispered. Stories are nice. Evidence is better. When it was my turn to take the stand, it felt like walking into the final level of a video game I had been playing on hard mode for years. I swore to tell the truth, sat down, and looked at the judge. She was a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, looking bored by the family drama. Nina didn't waste time with emotional appeals. She went straight for the jugular. Ms. Pierce, Nina asked, did you ever promise your father or uncle ownership of the lake house? No, I said clearly. My grandmother left it to me specifically because she feared they would sell it. And regarding the claim that they paid for everything, I have bank statements here, I said, handing over a thick binder, showing that I have paid the property taxes, the insurance, and the major repair bills for the last 3 years from my own salary. The judge flipped through the binder, eyebrows raising slightly. Now, Nina said, her voice sharpening, let's address the plaintiff's claim that you tricked them. Ms. Pierce, please explain Exhibit C. We played the recording. Not the whole thing, just the clip from the bar. The courtroom was silent save for the hum of the lights and the sound of my father's voice filling the space. Alex isn't a daughter. She's leverage. Once we get that deed, we erase her and start over. I watched the judge's face. The boredom vanished. She looked up from her notes and stared directly at my father. He shrank into his cardigan, but the act wasn't working anymore. The malice in his recorded voice was too distinct to be ignored. And finally, Nina said, dropping the hammer, we have the matter of the deed submitted by the plaintiffs last week. The document they claim transferred the title to them 3 days before Ms. Pierce sold the property. Nina projected an image of the document onto the screen. This deed is dated October 14th. It bears a signature that looks like Ms. Pierce's, and it is notarized by a Mr. Henderson, a known associate of Mark Pierce. Ms. Pierce, Nina asked me. Where were you on October 14th? I was in Chicago, I said, at a design conference. Do you have proof? I have my flight records, my hotel receipt, and a geotagged selfie I took with a keynote speaker at the exact time this document was supposedly being signed in Maple Ridge. We submitted the proofs. The timeline was irrefutable. My father and uncle hadn't just lied, they had been sloppy. In their desperation to stop the sale, they had forged a document and backdated it, unaware that I had a digital alibi. The energy in the room shifted violently. The judge took off her glasses and set them down with a sharp clack. She looked at the plaintiff's lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in shuffling his papers. Counsel, the judge said, her voice like grinding stones. Your clients have submitted a forged instrument to this court as evidence. They have filed a frivolous lawsuit to harass a legal property owner, and they have done so after conspiring to commit financial fraud, which we just heard on tape. Your Honor, the lawyer stammered. Silence, she snapped. I am dismissing this case with prejudice. The sale of the property stands. Ms. Pierce keeps the proceeds. Furthermore, I am granting the defendant's request for a permanent protective order. Mr. Richard Pierce, Mr. Mark Pierce, and Mrs. Elaine Pierce are to have no contact with the defendant. You will not go near her home. You will not go near her workplace. She paused, looking at my father with pure disgust. And I am referring this matter, specifically the forged deed and the identity theft, to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. We are done here. The gavel bang was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It sounded like a chain breaking. I stood up, my legs shaking, but I didn't fall. I looked back at the gallery. Mrs. Ramos, my neighbor from the lake, was sitting in the back row. She gave me a small, fierce nod. A coworker who had witnessed the lobby scene was there too, and she gave me a thumbs up. The narrative had broken. The town knew. I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than air, but the ghosts weren't quite gone yet. In the hallway, waiting for the elevator, I found myself standing 10 feet away from them. The lawyer had abandoned them to make a phone call. It was just me and the family I had lost. They looked small. Stripped of their schemes and their moral high ground, they were just 3 aging people facing a criminal investigation. My mother wouldn't look at me. Uncle Mark was staring at the floor, muttering to himself, but my father looked at me. The soft cardigan couldn't hide the venom in his eyes. He stepped forward, ignoring the protective order that was barely 5 minutes old. You think you won, he hissed, his voice low and raspy. You have money now, sure. But you have no one. You cut out your own blood. You'll regret this when you're alone in the dark. I looked at him. I waited for the old fear to rise up. I waited for the guilt, the urge to apologize, the desperate need to be the good daughter. It didn't come. Instead, I felt a profound, cool relief. It was like setting down a backpack filled with rocks that I had been carrying for 20 years. I won't be alone, Dad, I said quietly. I'll be safe, and honestly, I'd rather be alone in the dark than sitting at a table with people who want to eat me alive. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, I saw him standing there, his mouth opening to say something else, but the metal doors slid shut, cutting him off mid-sentence. I took a deep breath of the stale elevator air. It tasted like freedom. My new life didn't begin with a bang or a party. It began with a sound. It was the heavy, solid click of the deadbolt sliding into place on the door of my new apartment. It was a 1-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the city. There was no lake view, no grand heritage, and no sprawling deck. But as I stood there that first night, staring at the door, I realized something profound. I was the only person in the world who had a key. For the first time in 29 years, I was safe behind a barrier that no family member could guilt trick or bully their way through. I didn't let the money from the sale change who I was, but I let it change my future. My father and uncle had expected me to be financially illiterate, to blow through cash the way they did. They were wrong about that too. I paid off every cent of my student loans in a single afternoon. I set up an emergency fund that could carry me for 2 years if I never worked another day. But the most satisfying check I wrote was a donation. I gave a significant portion of the proceeds to a local legal aid organization that specifically helps young adults disentangle themselves from financially abusive family members. I wanted to make sure that the next good daughter who walked into their office wouldn't have to fight alone. I also channeled my energy back into my work, but with a new purpose. At the architectural firm, I started pitching a concept I called the Sanctuary Project. It was a design initiative for co-living spaces and nonprofit housing focused on resilient spaces designed with secure access, private retreats, and communal areas for people rebuilding their lives after trauma. I poured my experience into the blueprints, designing the kind of walls that protect rather than imprison. My definition of family changed too. It wasn't about blood anymore. It was about behavior. Mrs. Ramos, my neighbor from the lake, took a bus into the city to visit me a few months after the trial. She walked into my apartment holding a small clay pot wrapped in newspaper. "I dug this up before the new owners started their landscaping," she told me, handing it over. It was a cutting from one of Grandma Rose's hydrangea bushes, the ones that used to line the porch. "I thought you should have the part of the house that actually bloomed." I placed it on my windowsill, a piece of the past that didn't carry the poison of the people who lived there. Slowly, I filled my life with people who respected the word no. I made friends who didn't keep score. I started seeing a man who, when I told him I needed space, simply said, "Okay," and gave it to me without punishment. It was terrifying at first, trusting people without waiting for the other shoe to drop, but I was learning that love isn't a debt you have to constantly repay. 6 months after the court date, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself driving north. I hadn't planned to, but the car seemed to know the way. I didn't drive up the gravel driveway of the lake house. I respected the property lines, my own and the new owners. Instead, I parked at the public boat launch across the bay. I sat on the hood of my car and looked across the water. The house looked different. The new owners had painted the cedar siding a deep modern navy blue. The dock had been expanded. There were kayaks on the lawn that I didn't recognize. I waited for the anger to hit me. I waited for the stinging sense of loss, the feeling that I had been exiled from my own history. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, quiet distance. That structure across the water wasn't my home anymore. It was just a house. It was just wood and glass and shingles. The home, the safety, the peace, the future wasn't in the building. It was in me. I had carried it out with me the day I recorded that phone call. I thought about my parents then. I knew they were still in town dealing with the criminal fraud investigation that was slowly grinding through the legal system. I knew their reputation was shattered, that the charismatic builder mask had been ripped off for good. I felt a pang of grief, but it wasn't for them. It was for the parents I wished I'd had. I grieved for the little girl who sat at the dinner table terrified of the electricity bill. I grieved for the young woman who turned down her dream job to save a business that was already dead. But grief is just love with nowhere to go, and I was done giving my love to a black hole. I hopped off the hood of the car and looked at the water one last time. My father had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was weak, that I was nothing without him, that I was just an extension of his will. He thought he could write the end of my story. I got back into my car and started the engine. The radio was playing a song I liked, and the sun was hitting the dashboard just right. My dad once said I was just leverage. He saw me as a poker chip, to be cashed out, something to be used, and then erased when the hand was played. He was wrong. I am not what they spent. I am not the empty space where a daughter used to be. I am what survived the fire. I am the architect of my own life now, and that is the part of the story they never planned for. I put the car in drive and turned back toward the city, leaving the lake behind me in the rearview mirror, getting smaller and smaller until it was gone. Alexandra Pierce finally closed the book on the debt she never owed, choosing self-preservation over forced loyalty and the promise of a safe, self-made future. What would you have done if your own family tried to erase you? Share your thoughts below. We read every single comment you send. If you want more true-life betrayal stories, be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.